Apollo 15 was the 9th manned mission in the United States' Apollo program, the 4th to land on the Moon, and the 8th successful manned mission. It was the first of what were termed J missions, long stays on the Moon, with a greater focus on science than had been possible on previous missions. It was also the first mission on which the Lunar Roving Vehicle was used. The mission began on July 26, 1971, and ended on August 7. At the time, NASA called it the most successful manned flight ever achieved. Commander David Scott and lunar module pilot James Irwin spent 3 days on the Moon, including 18.5 hours outside the spacecraft on lunar extravehicular activity. The mission landed near Hadley Rill, in an area of the mare Imbrium called Palus Putredianus. A crew explored the area using the first lunar rover, which allowed them to travel much farther from the lunar module than had been possible on missions without the rover. They collected 77 kilograms of lunar surface material. At the same time, Command Module pilot Alfred Worden orbited the Moon, using a scientific instrument module in the service module to study the lunar surface and environment in great detail with a panoramic camera, a gamma-ray spectrometer, a mapping camera, a laser altimeter, a mass spectrometer, and a lunar sub-satellite deployed at the end of Apollo 15's stay in lunar orbit. The mission successfully accomplished its objectives, but was marred by negative publicity that accompanied disclosure of the crew carrying unauthorized postage stamps which they had planned to sell after the return. Ironically, this mission was one of very few that had been honored with the issue of a commemorative U.S. stamp, with this first use of a lunar rover happening 1 decade after the first Mercury astronaut launch. Crew. All 3 astronauts on the all-United States Air Force crew received an honorary degree, a master's degree from the University of Michigan, including Scott's honorary degree, awarded in the spring of 1971, months before the launch. Scott had attended the University of Michigan, but left before graduating to accept an appointment to the United States Military Academy. A crewman did their undergraduate work at either the United States Military Academy or the United States Naval Academy. Backup crew Schmidt was the first member of Group 4 to be selected as a prime backup crew member for an Apollo flight. From Group 4 he was the only astronaut to make it to the Moon, with the last Apollo mission at the end of 1972. Support crew C. Gordon Fullerton, Joseph P. Allen, Robert A. Parker, Carl G. Hennies. Flight directors Jerry Griffin, Gold Team; Milton Windler, Maroon Team; Glyn Lunny, Black Team; Gene Kranz, White Team. Mission parameters: mass, launch mass 2,945,816 kilograms, total spacecraft 46,782 kilograms, CSM mass 30,354 kilograms, of which CM was 5,840 kilograms, EDM 24,523 kilograms, LM mass 16,428 kilograms, ascent staged lunar liftoff 4,951 kilograms. Earth orbits 3 before leaving for Moon. Lunar orbits 74. Earth parking orbit perigee 169.5 kilometers, apogee 171.3 kilometers, inclination 29.679 degrees, period 87.84 minutes. LMCSM docking undocked July 30, 1971, 18 hours 13 minutes and 16 seconds UTC. Docked August 2, 1971, 19 hours 10 minutes and 25 seconds UTC. Evascot stand-up EVA LM upper hatch. Start stand-up evac July 31, 1971, 0 hours 16 minutes and 49 seconds UTC. End stand-up evac July 31, 0 hours 49 minutes and 56 seconds UTC. Duration 33 minutes 07 seconds. Scott and Owen, EVA 1. EVA 1 start, July 31, 1971, 13 hours 12 minutes and 17 seconds UTC. EVA 1 end, July 31, 19 hours 45 minutes and 59 seconds UTC. Duration, 6 hours, 32 minutes, 42 seconds. Scott and Owen, EVA 2. EVA 2 start, August 1, 1971, 11 hours 48 minutes and 48 seconds UTC. EVA 2 end, August 1, 19 hours 1 minute and 2 seconds UTC. Duration, 7 hours 12 minutes 14 seconds. Scott and Owen, EVA 3. EVA 3 start, August 2, 1971, 8 hours 52 minutes and 14 seconds UTC. EVA 3 end, August 2, 13 hours 42 minutes and 4 seconds UTC. Duration, 4 hours, 49 minutes, 50 seconds. Warden, Transearth EVA 4. EVA 4 start, August 5, 1971, 15 hours 31 minutes and 12 seconds UTC. EVA 4 end, August 5, 16 hours 10 minutes and 19 seconds UTC. Duration, 39 minutes 07 seconds. Planning and training. A crew for Apollo 15 had previously served as the backup crew for Apollo 12. There had been a friendly rivalry between the prime and backup crew on that mission, with the prime being all United States Navy, and the backup all United States Air Force. Originally Apollo 15 would have been an H mission, like Apollos 12, 13, and 14. But on September 2, 1970, NASA announced it was cancelling what were to be the current incarnations of the Apollo 15 and Apollo 19 missions. To maximize the return from the remaining missions, Apollo 15 would now fly as a J mission and have the honor of carrying the first lunar rover. One of the major changes in the training for Apollo 15 was the geology training. Although on previous flights the crews had been trained in field geology, for the first time Apollo 15 would make it a high priority. Scott and Owen would train with Leon Silver, a Caltech geologist who on Earth was interested in the Precambrian. Silver had been suggested by Harrison Schmitt as an alternative to the classroom lecturers that NASA had previously used. Among other things, Silver had made important refinements to the methods for dating rocks using the decay of uranium into lead in the late 1950s. At first Silver would take the prime and backup crews to various geological sites in Arizona and New Mexico as if for a normal field geology lesson. But as launch time approached, these trips became more realistic. Crews began to wear mock-ups of the backpacks they would carry, and communicate using walkie-talkies to a Capcom in a tent. Always fellow astronauts were the only people who normally would speak to the crew. The Capcom was accompanied by a group of geologists unfamiliar with the area who would rely on the astronauts' descriptions to interpret the findings. The decision to land at Hadley came in September 1970. The site selection committees had narrowed the field down to two sites, Hadley Real of the crater Marius, near which were a group of low, possibly volcanic, domes. Although not ultimately his decision, the commander of a mission always held great sway. To David Scott the choice was clear, with Hadley being exploration at its finest. Command Module pilot Alfred Worden undertook a different kind of geology training. Working with an Egyptian-born geologist, Farouk El-Baz, he flew over areas in an airplane simulating the speed at which terrain would pass below him while in the Apollo Command Service module in orbit. He became quite adept at making geologic observations as objects passed below. Mission highlights. Launch and outbound trip. Apollo 15 was launched on July 26, 1971, at 9:34 a.m. EDT from the Kennedy Space Center at Merritt Island, Florida. During the launch, the SIC did not completely shut off following staging for 4 seconds, creating the possibility of the spent stage banging into the S2 engines, damaging them and forcing an abort. Despite this, the third stage and spacecraft reached its planned Earth parking orbit. A couple of hours into the mission, the third stage reignited to propel the spacecraft out of Earth orbit and onto the Moon. A few days after launching from Florida, the spacecraft passed behind the far side of the Moon, where the Service Propulsion System engine on the CSM ignited for a 6-minute burn, to slow the craft down into an initial lunar orbit. Once the lowest point of altitude in the orbit was reached, the SPS engine was fired again, to place the spacecraft into the proper descent orbit for the lunar module landing at Hadley. Moon landing. Most of the first part of the day after arriving in lunar orbit on July 30 was spent in preparing the lunar module for descent to the lunar surface. Later on the day, when preparations were complete, undocking from the CSM was attempted. It did not occur, because of a faulty seal in the hatch mechanism. The command module pilot, Alfred Worden, resealed the hatch. The LM then separated from the CSM. David Scott and James Irwin continued preparations for the descent while Worden remained in the CSM, returning to a higher orbit to perform lunar observations and await his crewmates' return a few days later. Soon, Scott and Irwin began the descent to the Hadley landing site. Several minutes after descent was initiated, at pitch over and the beginning of the approach phase of the landing, the LM was 6 kilometers east of the pre-selected landing target. On learning this, Scott altered the flight path of the LM. They touched down at 22 hours 16 minutes and 29 seconds UTC on July 30 at Hadley, within a few hundred meters of the planned landing site. One of the legs of the LM landed in a small crater, so the module was tilted by 10 degrees. The maximum acceptable was 15 degrees. While previous crews had exited the lunar module shortly after landing, a crew of Apollo 15 elected to spend the rest of the day inside the LM, waiting until the next day to perform the first of 3 EVAS or moonwalks, in order to preserve the sleep rhythm on a mission on which they were to spend a significantly longer time on the surface than previous crews had spent. Before they slept, Scott performed a stand-up EVA, during which the LM was depressurized and he photographed the surroundings from the top docking hatch. Lunar surface. Throughout the sleep period, Mission Control in Houston monitored a slow but steady oxygen leak. The data output of the onboard telemetry computers was limited during the night to conserve energy, so controllers could not determine the exact cause of the leak without awaking the crew. Scott and Irwin eventually were awakened an hour early, and the source of the leak was found to be an open valve on the urine transfer device. After the problem was solved, the crew began preparation for the first moonwalk. 4 hours later, Scott and Irwin became the 7th and 8th humans, respectively, to walk on the Moon. After unloading the Lunar Roving Vehicle, the two drove to the first moonwalk's primary destination, Elbow Crater, along the edge of Hadley Rill. On returning to the LM Falcon, Scott and Irwin deployed the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package. The first EVA lasted about 6.5 hours. The target of the second EVA, the next day, was the edge of Mount Hadley Delta, where the pair sampled boulders and craters along the Apennine front. During this moonwalk, the astronauts recovered what came to be one of the more famous lunar samples collected on the Moon during Apollo. Sample number 15,415, more commonly known as the Genesis rock. Once back at the landing site, Scott continued to try to drill holes for an experiment at the ALSEP site, with which he had struggled the day before. After conducting soil mechanics experiments and erecting a U.S. flag, Scott and Irwin returned to the LM. EVA 2 lasted 7 hours and 12 minutes. During EVA 3, the third and final moonwalk of the mission, the crew again ventured to the edge of Hadley Rill, this time to the northwest of the immediate landing site. After returning to the LM's location, Scott performed an experiment in view of the television camera, using a feather and hammer to demonstrate Galileo's theory that all objects in a given gravity field fall at the same rate regardless of mass. He dropped the hammer and feather at the same time. Because of the negligible lunar atmosphere, there was no drag on the feather, which hit the ground at the same time as the hammer. Scott then drove the rover to a position away from the LM, where the television camera could be used to observe the lunar liftoff. Before the mission, a crew had contacted Belgian sculptor Paul van Hooijdonk to create a small aluminum statuette called Fallen Astronaut to commemorate those astronauts and cosmonauts who lost their lives in the pursuit of space exploration. Scott left the sculpture by the rover, along with a plaque bearing the names of 14 American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts who were known up to the time. The memorial was left while the television camera was turned off. Only Irwin knew what Scott was doing at the time. Scott told Mission Control he was doing some clean-up activities around the rover. The EVA lasted 4 hours and 50 minutes. In total, the two astronauts spent 18.5 hours outside the LM and collected approximately 77 kilograms of lunar samples. Returned to Earth after lifting off from the lunar surface 2 days and 18 hours after landing. The LM ascent stage rendezvoused and redocked with the CSM with Warden aboard in orbit. After transferring samples and other items from the LM to the CSM, the LM was sealed off, jettisoned, and intentionally crashed into the lunar surface. After completing more observations of the Moon from orbit and releasing the sub-satellite, the three-person crew departed lunar orbit with another burn of the SPS engine. The next day, on the return trip to Earth, Warden performed a spacewalk in deep space, the first of its kind, to retrieve exposed film from the Sim Bay. Later on in the day, the crew set a record for the longest Apollo flight to that point. On approach to Earth the next day, August 7th, the service module was jettisoned, and the command module re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Although one of the 3 parachutes on the CM failed to deploy properly, only 2 were required for a safe landing. Upon landing in the North Pacific Ocean, a crew were recovered and taken aboard the recovery ship Okinawa after a mission lasting 12 days, 7 hours, 11 minutes, and 53 seconds. Hardware: spacecraft Apollo 15 used Command Service Module CSM-112, which was given the call sign Endeavour, named after the HMS Endeavour, and Lunar Module LM-10, call sign Falcon, named after the United States Air Force Academy mascot. If Apollo 15 had flown as an H mission, it would have been with CSM-111 and LM-9. The CSM was used by the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, but the lunar module went unused and is now on display at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. After re-entry, one of Endeavour's 3 main parachutes collapsed after opening. Only 2 of the 3 parachutes were required for safe splashdown. The third was a contingency. Endeavour ultimately splashed down safely to end the mission. Technicians at the Kennedy Space Center had many problems with the SIM-bay in the service module. It was the first time it had flown and experienced problems from the start. Problems came from the fact the instruments were designed to operate in zero gravity, but had to be tested in the 1 gram on the surface of the Earth. As such, things like the 7.5 meters booms for the mass and gamma-ray spectrometers could only be tested using railings that tried to mimic the space environment, and so they never worked particularly well. When the technicians tried to integrate the entire bay into the rest of the spacecraft, data streams would not synchronize, and lead investigators of the instruments would want to make last-minute checks and changes. When it came time to test the operation of the gamma-ray spectrometer, it was necessary to stop every engine within 10 miles of the test site. On the lunar module, the fuel and oxidizer tanks were enlarged on both the descent and ascent stages, and the engine bell on the descent stage was extended. Batteries and solar cells were added for increased electrical power. In all, this increased the weight of the lunar module to 36,000 pounds, 4,000 pounds heavier than previous models. Endeavour is currently on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Lunar Rover. The Lunar Roving Vehicle had been in development since May 1969, with the contract awarded to Boeing. It could be folded into a space 5 feet by 20 in. Unloaded, it weighed 460 pounds, and when carrying 2 astronauts and their equipment, 1,500 pounds. Each wheel was independently driven by 1/4 of a horsepower electric motor. Although it could be driven by either astronaut, the commander always drove, traveling at speeds up to 6 to 8 miles per hour. It meant that for the first time the astronauts could travel far afield from the lander and still have enough time to do some scientific experiments. Lunar subsatellite. The Apollo 15 subsatellite was a small satellite released into lunar orbit from the SIM-bay. Its main objectives were to study the plasma, particle, and magnetic field environment of the Moon and map the lunar gravity field. Specifically, it measured plasma and energetic particle intensities and vector magnetic fields, and facilitated tracking of the satellite velocity to high precision. A basic requirement was that the satellite acquire fields and particle data everywhere on the orbit around the Moon. The Moon's roughly circular orbit about the Earth at 380,000 kilometers carried the sub-satellite into both interplanetary space and various regions of the Earth's magnetosphere. The satellite orbited the Moon and returned data from August 4, 1971 until January 1973. In later years, through a study of many lunar orbiting satellites, scientists came to discover that most low lunar orbits are unstable. Fortunately, PFS-1 had been placed, unknown to mission planners at the time, very near to one of only 4 lunar frozen orbits, where a lunar satellite may remain indefinitely. Releasing the sub-satellite was the crew's final activity in lunar orbit, occurring an hour before the burn to take them back to Earth. A virtually identical sub-satellite was deployed by Apollo 16 launch vehicle. The Saturn V that launched Apollo 15 was designated SAR 510, the 10th flight-ready model of the rocket. As the payload of the rocket was greater, changes were made to its launch trajectory in Saturn V itself. The rocket was launched in a more southerly direction and the Earth parking orbit lowered to 166 kilometers above the Earth's surface. These two changes meant 1,100 pounds more could be launched. The propellant reserves were reduced and the number of retro rockets on the SIC first stage reduced from 8 to 4. The 4 outboard engines of the SIC would be burned longer and the center engine would also burn longer before being shut down. Changes were also made to the S2 to stop pogo oscillations. Once all the various components had been installed on the Saturn V, it was moved to the launch site, Launch Complex 39A. During late June and early July 1971, the rocket and launch umbilical tower were struck by lightning at least 4 times. All was well, however, with only minor damage suffered. Space suits. The astronauts themselves wore new space suits. On all previous Apollo flights, including the non-lunar flights, the commander and lunar module pilot had worn suits with the life support, liquid cooling, and communications connections in 2 parallel rows of 3. On Apollo 15, the new suits, dubbed the A7LB, had the connectors situated in triangular pairs. This new arrangement, along with the relocation of the entry zipper from the right shoulder to the left hip, allowed the inclusion of a new waist joint, allowing the astronauts to bend completely over and to sit on the rover. Upgraded backpacks allowed for longer duration moonwalks, and the command module pilot, who wore a suit with 3 connectors, would wear a 5-connector version of the old moon suit, the liquid cooling water connector being removed, as the command module pilot would make a deep space evac to retrieve film cartridges on the flight home. Scandals. After a successful mission, the reputations of the crew and NASA were tarnished by a deal the crew had made with a German stamp dealer, H. Walter Eiermann, who had many professional and social contacts with NASA employees and the astronaut corps. Arranged for Scott to carry unauthorized commemorative postal covers in his spacesuit. In addition to the postal covers NASA had contracted to carry for the United States Postal Service, Eiermann had promised each astronaut $7,000 in the form of savings accounts in return for 100 covers signed after having been on the moon. He told the astronauts that he would not advertise or sell the covers until the end of the Apollo program. Irwin wrote in his book To Rule the Night that the astronauts had agreed to the deal as a way to help finance the children's college tuition. Another controversy arose after the flight caused by the fallen astronaut statuette that Scott had left on the moon. A crew claimed they had agreed with the sculptor, Paul Van Hoedonk, that no replicas were to be made, in order to satisfy NASA's aversion to commercial exploitation of the space program. After the sculpture's existence was publicly disclosed during the post-flight press conference, the National Air and Space Museum contacted the crew asking for a replica made for the museum. Van Hoedonk, whose account of the agreement contradicts Scott's, subsequently advertised replicas for sale to the public. Under pressure from NASA, Van Hoedonk withdrew the sale offer. Mission insignia. The 3 astronauts of Apollo 15 were all United States Air Force active duty officers, and the patch carries Air Force motifs. The circular patch features stylized red, white and blue birds flying over the Hadley Rill section of the moon. Immediately behind the birds, a line of craters form the Roman numeral 15. The artwork is circled in red, with a white band giving the mission and crew names on a blue border. Scott contacted fashion designer Emilio Pucci to design the patch, who came up with the basic idea of the three-bird motif on a square patch. A crew changed the shape around and the colors from blues and greens to a patriotic red, white and blue. Warden stated that each bird also represented an astronaut, white being his own color, with Scott the blue bird and Owen the red. The Roman numeral design was created when NASA insisted that the mission number be displayed in Arabic numerals. Visibility from space. The halo area of the Apollo 15 landing site, generated by the LM's exhaust plume, was observed by a camera aboard the Japanese lunar orbiter Selene and confirmed by comparative analysis of photographs in May 2008. This corresponds well to photographs taken from the Apollo 15 command module showing a change in surface reflectivity due to the plume, and was the first visible trace of manned landings on the Moon seen from space since the close of the Apollo program. Multimedia. Apollo 15. Depiction in popular culture. The Apollo 15 mission is dramatized in the episode Galileo Was Right of the 1998 HBO miniseries From the Earth to the Moon. The lunar rover from Apollo 15 is featured in the PlayStation 3 sim racing game Gran Turismo 6. In the classic Avengers story arc, The Kree-Skrull War, published by Marvel Comics in 1971-1972, Captain Marvel attempts to steal the Apollo 15 Saturn V, modify it, and return to the Kree homeworld to stop Ronan the Accuser. Bibliography.